Hey guys, it's Quickie Baby and welcome back to World of Tanks, and this time I've got a full tank review for you on the Tier 9 British tank destroyer, the turreted tank destroyer, the FV4004 Conway. The Conway is a hybrid vehicle. It combines the mobility of a medium tank with the flexibility that comes with having a fully traversable turret, while still having the amazing raw power of a tank destroyer with one of the highest DPMs in World of Tanks. If that sounds like your kind of vehicle, stick around. I'm going to let you know everything there is to know about the Conway. Follow it up with multiple Ace Tanker gameplay. And if you have no interest in purchasing this Tier 9 turreted British tank destroyer, then I will highlight the weaknesses of the Conway so you can take them out effectively on the battlefield. So looking at the Conway, you might think that it's a bit of a Frankenstein tank, and that's because it really is. The Conway was kind of a halfway house between the Centurion and the Conqueror. They wanted to be able to mount this more powerful 120mm gun on the Centurion chassis, and so that's why they came up with this god-awful turret. But considering this is a post-World War II tank, you might be wondering, why did they feel the need to rush it so fast? And that's because on September the 7th, 1945, during a Victory Day parade in Berlin, the Soviet Union paraded this monster, the IS-3. The British were so impressed and also terrified of this tank, fearing an altercation with the Soviet Union, that they had to try and get that 120mm gun mounted on something as soon as possible, and the Conqueror wasn't ready. But irrelevant of its historical situation, how does the FV4004 fit into World of Tanks? Well, the easiest way to figure that out is to compare it to its Tier 9 British counterparts, the Conqueror and the Tortoise. So here we have the FV4004 Conway on the left, the Tortoise, the AMX 50 Foch because it also uses 120mm and is at Tier 9, and the Conqueror, a Tier 9 heavy tank, on the right. So immediately we see that the FV4004 has monster DPM, over 3000. When we compare that to the top DPMs in the game, we see that while, unlike the Tortoise, it's not number one with just that monstrous nearly 3400 DPM, you still don't have to go too far down the list to see the Conway, and it might surprise you that it's higher than tanks such as the Object 430, the Waffenträger Alfie 100, nearly on par with the Object 263 and the T-57 heavy tank. When you compare it to the Tier 9 French tank destroyer, the AMX 50 Foch, it has 20% more DPM. And it's way above the Conqueror, 33% more DPM. You're going to fire nearly 2 extra rounds a minute than a Conqueror, which is probably the Conway's main strength over the Tier 9 British heavy tank. So how about the weapon handling? Well, its aim time isn't half bad for a turreted tank destroyer. It's 1.9, which is the same as the Conqueror, slightly worse than the Tortoise. And its accuracy is a very healthy 0.32. Better than the Conqueror, but slightly worse than the Tortoise. One thing that should be mentioned, like a lot of tank destroyers, this vehicle gets horrific dispersion values when you turn the tank and when you move the tank. And with the FV4004 Conway, you really can't afford to move in between your shots, unlike you could in a heavy tank such as the Conqueror. However, the dispersion with a turret traverse is 0.1, which is just as good as the Conqueror, but you also need to take into account that this vehicle doesn't have vertical stabilizers like the Conqueror does. Unfortunately, the Conway doesn't have very good elevation angles, 10 degrees, which is very frustrating. When you're going down slope, you're not going to be able to shoot up at your opponents. And its depression values are only 5 degrees as well. That really sucks. That's the same as a Soviet medium tank such as the T-62A, and isn't anywhere near as good as the Tortoise with a wonderful 10 degrees, or the Conqueror that gets a healthy 7. But one thing that the Conway does have over the Tortoise is a fully traversable turret, which just makes it so much more flexible in combat. So how about the mobility of the Conway? As we mentioned, it's on a Centurion hull, and it can go at 35 kilometers an hour, which just leaves the Tortoise behind as an immobile object. Fair enough, it can't quite keep up with the Foch, but it is 1 kilometer an hour faster than the Conqueror. And it also goes backwards very fast indeed. The Conway is able to get forwards into position, put off a shot, and then pull back into cover. 20 kilometers an hour backwards is nothing to be sniffed at. A lot of heavy tanks such as the Conqueror really can't get back quick enough or prevent their opponents from flanking them in the side. The Conway, however, is very proficient at doing that. The tank gets a whopping horsepower of 950 when you take into account how heavy it is, just over 50 tons. That's nearly 15 tons less than the Conqueror, and a third less than the Tortoise. And when you consider that it gets more engine power than the Tortoise, where the Tortoise only gets 810. That means that its power-to-weight ratio is so much better than the Tortoise, and also so much better than the Conqueror. Its power-to-weight ratio is very healthy, almost like a medium tank, and if this vehicle wasn't limited to 35 kilometers an hour, it would be very fast indeed. Also, one thing that's awesome about this vehicle are the terrain resistances. On hard terrain, it's 1. That is 0.3 better than the Tortoise, and even 0.1 better than the Conqueror. It's also better on medium terrain, and much better on soft terrain. This vehicle, a lot like the high-tier British medium tank chassis that it has, simply gets around. It can shift. Be careful with the turret traverse speed on this vehicle, however. It's 16 degrees, which is not nearly as good as the Conqueror. And that means that if you want to quickly re-engage your targets, you often have to turn your vehicle and then get this awful dispersion bloom, which is very frustrating. So how about the hull armor? Well, it's unfortunately only 76 millimeters, basically like the Centurion Mark 1. And at the side it's 15, at the rear it's 38. Which means that realistically you are not bouncing anything in the Conway until you hyper-angle the armor like this, getting above that 70 degrees for an auto ricochet. And so if you see an FV4004 Conway, don't be afraid to shoot this thing in the hull armor. A lot like a Centurion 1, you are going to brutalize it, and it doesn't have the gun depression with only 5 degrees to be able to get anywhere near the front of the tank, being very effective at all. So how about the turret armor on the Conway? Well, it's actually rather nice compared to the Tier 10 British turreted tank destroyer. It's 132 millimeters on the front, and this tank also has quite a nice mantlet, with some areas being 300, other areas being about 150 to 180. This tank can actually be quite surprising with the turret armor, and a lot of people underestimate it. One thing that's also quite nice about where the gun is situated is that it's at the top of the turret, and so that means that there isn't actually very much area at the top for your opponents to shoot without you being able to shoot them. Which, as we can see here, is a very frustrating aspect about the Tier 10 British tank destroyer, the FV4005. Your opponents can just shoot the top of it, and it's bad enough that this fat turret only has 14 millimeters of turret armor. And trust me, when you've played this tank, you'll want to wish that you were back in the Conway and at least be able to ricochet quite a few rounds and not get penetrated every single time an artillery or a high explosive round lands anywhere near your vehicle. Now, I'm in no way suggesting that you expose your turret armor in the Conway, but all I'm saying is that after you play the Tier 10 British tank destroyer, you will appreciate the Conway's turret. So the health of this tank is a lot worse than the Tortoise, 500 hit points less at 1,500, and vastly worse than the Conqueror as well, 450 less than that tank. Which quite often means that in the Conway you do feel like you shed your hit points very fast, and it's something that you should consider if you're trying to choose between the Tier 9 British vehicles. The view range in the Conway is also less than the Tortoise and much less than the Conqueror, but if you combine this with coated optics or binoculars, you're still going to get a very healthy view range. And so that about covers the statistics of the Conway. We found that while the vehicle does have a turret, it's in no way as good as the Conqueror. It doesn't turn as quickly, it doesn't have as much armor, it doesn't have as much gun depression, but it is still a fully functional turret. We've found that the vehicle, however, has a much better 120mm gun that can rip apart its opponents faster than a heavy tank could ever dream of, as well as the mobility of a medium tank, albeit that its top speed limit is quite limited at 35 kilometers an hour. But the vehicle just can't compete in a shootout with the Tortoise, both with regards to the amount of hit points that it has and also with the performance of the 120mm mounted on both vehicles. But I think that's quite enough theory crafting. Let's get stuck into some gameplay. So first up, we're going to be playing on Winterberg. Quite a nice matchup. There are 4 Tier 10s, 5 Tier 9s, including the self-propelled gun, and then I guess a lot of Tier 8s propping up the bottom. Now, I've got loads of games in the Conway where I'm frankly just sitting at the back of maps such as Malinovka and Prokhorovka or Airfield and just ripping apart opponents that frankly either couldn't see me or I was just supporting allies. What I wanted to do here is really show you what the difference between the Conway is and a tank such as the Conqueror and a tank such as the Tortoise. The Conway, I'm here faster than a Tortoise could be. I'm probably here faster than a Conqueror might be. And I'm already in position, spotting and ripping apart my opponents. We put 1 into that E100. I don't quite have the gun depression there though, so I readjust my position. This 5 degrees of gun depression, not enough to hit the hull armor of the T30. Don't really want to block this T54. And that really shows you what you kind of have to do in the Conway. You have to be in these kind of positions where maybe your medium tanks would be. but you bring tank destroyer, like at least AA tank destroyer level 120mm DPM performance. You know, you still get the penetration, a mouse in the side, right into the back, 452 damage. In the first minute or so of the game, we've already picked up 3 shots. And hopefully we can put another one into the C100. But as soon as he turns his turret towards me, I need to be very afraid. I do not want to get hit by that gun. If he's using high explosive rounds, he's going to beast me. One thing that's interesting here is that in retrospect, I was kind of going hull down over the back of that T-54. And that's because the Conway is so damn tall. You pretty much can just shoot over opponents if the need would be. But it's kind of bad manners, and I wouldn't really recommend doing it. So we're unable to go through the E100 there. We pull back and try and put one into the side of the E75. Just get a feel for the DPM that this tank has. This rate of fire may be shocking you, especially if you're not used to, say, for example, the T-57 Heavy. Fair enough, that vehicle has an autoloader, but that's kind of where you need to go to have the same kind of DPM as the Tortoise has. So sorry, not the Tortoise, the Conway. Of course, the Tortoise would be firing another 10% faster than this. But with the Tortoise, you wouldn't have the flexibility that this tank has. So the aim time isn't bad. It will be slightly longer than the Conqueror. You can see how much the reticle blooms when we go forwards and backwards. As I mentioned in the stats review of this tank, that really is the main weakness of this vehicle. Wow, one right into the back of that Tiger II, also setting him on fire. Unfortunately for us, he has a premium fire extinguisher, and he puts it out before we managed to cook him. But it didn't do him much good as the LTTB finished him off. So we take our first hit of the game. It looks like that T-30 is using the 120mm, or he might even be using 105mm, considering the... Yeah, he will probably be considering the alpha damage that we took there. And this is very interesting. I hadn't really thought about comparing the Conway to the T-30. It's probably something that I will do after this game. But then again, a T-30 isn't very special unless you use the 155mm on that tank. And this vehicle is vastly more mobile than a T-30. The turret, obviously, on the T-30, I'd rather have the turret on the T-30. It's much more heavily armored than on the Conway. So now I'm going to be loading some APCR rounds in this tank. I didn't really talk about them in the garage, but they've got 326mm of penetration rather than 359. You don't really need APCR rounds in the Conway, but when you're shooting at an E100 who's frankly angling his armor rather well, like this, and you don't want to expose yourself to him, and you probably want to take your chances. Have that little bit of extra pen to be able to take him down. And unfortunately, I just wasted 3 APCR rounds there and didn't even manage to secure the kill. But we have picked up 4,758 damage this game in 4.5 minutes. I'm blooming happy with that. Now let's go and put the Conway into a close quarter situation and see if we can take out the opponents that are desperately trying to take the cap circle, albeit now that they're outnumbered pretty much 2-1. Soon it'll be 3-1 if we manage to pick apart a few more vehicles. Oh, or not if that happens, as the IS-7 on the enemy team takes out that Leopard prototype. So unfortunately for me now, I'm firing APCR rounds at an LTTB. But I have to admit, in this game, I was trying to chase my ace tanker, and so right now I could not be bothered. Oh goodness, look at that. Bad dispersion, bad accuracy. That E75 escapes with his life. And unfortunately, this 263 comes around the corner, so we're unable to get a shot into the IS-7, who focuses me. And do not fire on the move in this tank. It is not a medium, it is not a heavy. You see me just trying to push the Conway too far here. I'm trying to play it now as if it was a heavy or a medium, shooting on the move, not taking my chances, and that's what you need to do. You need to wait for your opponents to make a mistake and punish them. But one thing I do love is having this kind of DPM at the end of the game, as we're quickly able to pick up 2 kills before quite a lot of tanks could, maybe such as the Conqueror. So while I'm not particularly proud about my play towards the end of this game, I thought it was important to show that the Conway can't really do that on-the-move shooting like a Conqueror or a Centurion can. Really, the vehicle is just a highly mobile and quite flexible 120mm that wants to get into position, activate its binoculars, possibly its camo net if you want to use one on this vehicle, and outgun pretty much 99% of the tanks in the game. And if you get this vehicle and think that you're going to have all of the flexibility and reliability of a vehicle such as the Centurion 7-1 or a Conqueror, and combine it with the DPM of a 120mm tank destroyer, well then you might be quite disappointed. But anyway, let's take a look at some more gameplay.
Time to roll out.
So now we are playing on Winter Himmelsdorf, and unlike the previous game, this is a very nice matchup indeed. We have got a whole host of very juicy Tier 7 heavy tanks on the enemy team that this vehicle just simply rips apart. Against the turret on this vehicle, you have a chance to bounce tanks such as an IS, a T-29, a Tiger. They're really not going to bounce you, even if you hit them in the turret, apart from maybe the T-29, if you don't hit outside the mantlet area. The 120mm on this tank, you've kind of got almost double DPM. Not to the Tiger. The Tiger actually has quite a good rate of fire when you think about it, but compared to like the T-29 and the IS, you can just absolutely obliterate them. And you've even got more hit points than the IS and the T-29. And I believe that the same amount as a Tiger. That vehicle does get quite nice hit points. But I digress. I'm going off on comparing this tank to Tier 7 heavies, which really isn't a very good thing to do. I've made my way into this position because I'm going to punish anyone that tries to go round the west of Castle von Himmelsdorf. From here, I will be able to spot anyone that tries to locate up here, or even tries to push around here. But not only that, I'm also going to be able to harass anyone who tries to push along this slope. So we put a good hit into the AMX 1375. And talking about Tigers, oh, we got spotted, but I don't really care right now. I just want to get my shots off. And you can see that if you don't move the tank backwards and forwards very much, you can be very, very accurate in the Conway in between your shots. But that dastardly AMX 1375 has spotted me and is trying to take a few shots at me. And I can't even bounce the, I guess, the 75mm that tank has. That's as small of a gun that is ever going to hit this tank. Its armor is not very special. I mean, its turret, as we mentioned, can pull off a couple of bounces, but it's not really going to work out. I did not think that that IS was going to come around the corner, and he blooming well did. Oh, this is just not very fair, is it? Poor guy. Oh well. Oh, next up, is the VK going to do the same thing? Look at what I can do with the turret here. I can play it as if I'm a heavy tank, and it actually managed to ricochet a shot. I didn't fully aim at him. Frankly, I thought that I would be able to get away with not aiming fully. And this is where I really want to highlight the turret of the Conway. And there you go, there's a shot straight into the mantlet, as we were talking about in the garage. Especially when you're in little areas like this. The mantlet actually does cover quite a large proportion of the tank. And unlike the Tier 10 British tank destroyer, you are going to be able to bounce some shots, but it's never something that you should rely on in the Conway. Now here we've got a T-54 Mod 1 pushing around the corner. He really doesn't stand much chance against our 259mm of penetration, and neither does that T-69. This 3000 DPM is simply monstrous. And now this is a very interesting engagement here. Here's a Tortoise. There's my Tier 9 counterpart. The non-turreted Tier 9 British tank destroyer. We're going to see what we're going to be able to do. So not only am I preventing that Tortoise from pushing around the corner aggressively, well, he's actually decided to come round now and go after the Tiger too. But I want to try and stop the people shooting me from above before I shoot at the Tortoise some more. Now we failed to penetrate the side of his tank. I thought that with the side shot that we had that we might be able to go through there. But unlike him, I don't have weak points on top of my tank. One of the most horrible things about the Tortoise is it has big shoot me here icons in. And what can this Tortoise do? There's just frankly nothing that he can do. If he pulls back, I can get into position and take a shot at him. He managed to squeak one into me, but it still didn't do him much good as we hit him 4 times for 1 returned shot. Poor guy indeed. Now can we hit this KV-13 up on the hill? Check out the aim time after moving. It's quite long, even for 1.9 seconds. but not long enough to prevent us from getting the shot in. And so really I've picked these two replays as they show why the Conway's special. It's in between the Conqueror and it's in between the Tortoise. Has the mobility of a medium tank, still 90% of the DPM of a Tortoise, and much more DPM than the Conqueror, but doesn't have that kind of on-the-move flexibility that you would have with a medium or a heavy, but still has just so much better DPM than the Conqueror, and that's the only real reason why we play this, apart from the mobility. You sacrifice your armor and some of your flexibility to be able to get 33% more DPM and a lot of engine power. If this tank could go at 40 kilometers an hour, it would be absolutely golden. We can see that it's actually taken us quite a while to get here. I want to try and get out of this Tiger II's way. Okay, he managed to get back, and the T-29 shoots at me, but the shell got absorbed again. Look, people thinking they can just make fun of the Conway's turret, and you can't. But I can certainly make fun of your armor. Oh, one thing that I haven't mentioned about this tank yet is the Hesh rounds that it gets. And the Hesh round wasn't very effective against that T-29. We only managed to do 132 damage to him. We can put one more into him, and unfortunately we have to be careful now. I can't afford to sneak out and take the shot. We need him to miss. He needs to miss. Come on, I want the Top Gun. Let me have the Top Gun, then the game's nearly going to end in 2 seconds. Yes! No! Not enough gun depression in the Conway to be able to sneak one into the T-29. And I'm glad I noticed that at the end of the game. The Conway does get Hesh rounds, which basically work the same as high explosive rounds, just with higher penetration in World of Tanks. These 120mm Hesh rounds have 120mm of penetration. That is way higher than usually you would get on a 120mm gun. And considering that the alpha damage is 515 rather than 400, it's a way for you to make the monster DPM that this tank has just so much better. For example, if you're shooting its older brother, the FV4005, or maybe you're shooting at a Waffenträger Alpha 100 or a Borsig, you're going to be able to absolutely devastate them with these Hesh rounds. And also, they're very useful for taking out tanks that are maybe on 40 hit points or less. Even if it's a Mouse or an E100, you're probably still going to be able to splash some damage over it and take it out without having to penetrate it with an AP round. So a great round here for the Conway, 5 kills, 5,000 damage. It's just a shame that the 5 degrees of gun depression didn't allow us to get the T-29 at the end of the game. And also, maybe you could put it down to the hit points of this vehicle. While we did ricochet a couple of shots off the mantlet, only having 1,500 hit points, unlike the Tortoise's 2,000 or the Conqueror's 1,950, meant that we couldn't weather the storm to be able to successfully take down the T-29 ourselves. But unlike the Conqueror and the Tortoise, we were able to get into position very quickly and devastate anyone that tried to go around the west of Castle von Himmelsdorf. Then we had the perfect example of a Conway versus a Tortoise on this corner, which is something that I'm really trying to hammer home in these replays. But let's just take a quick look at the post-game stats. So on Winterberg, we got a high caliber in a tier 10 game, and that's because we did 6,200 damage in under 6 minutes. 1,319 base experience. We didn't get many kills though, and our armor didn't hold up at all against the IS-7 at the end of the game, as you would expect. We did fire a filthy amount of APCR rounds this game, and so we made 40 credits profit. But frankly, I was just chasing my ace tanker because for some reason it took me bloomin' ages to be able to get it in this vehicle. Next up, we got another high caliber and a tank sniper on Himmelsdorf for 5,700 damage in just over 6 minutes this time. The marksmanship we showed in the Conway was very nice, 20 hits out of 20 and 17 of those penetrated. And as I highlighted in the gameplay, we managed to block 560 damage with our armor. And thankfully this time I didn't fire any APCR rounds, so we made 35,000 credits profit. So just quickly, as I mentioned, during the game on Runeberg, I wanted to compare the Conway to a T-30 using 155mm and a T-30 using 120mm, and oh my word, the DPM is just ludicrous. I knew that the T-30's 155mm gun has bad DPM, but I didn't realize it was this bad. The Conway has nearly 50% more DPM than a T-30 using 155mm and still over 20% better DPM than if it chooses to use the 120mm. Of course, you also need to consider that having that 750 alpha damage on a T-30 is special. but is it worth sacrificing 50% DPM special? It also kills the tank with regards to aim time and massively with regards to accuracy. It also has much better dispersion when turning the turret, but worse dispersion when moving the tank. Much worse gun depression, which is one frustrating aspect about the Conway, but goes much faster backwards. Huge advantage with regards to horsepower to ton. Massively better ground resistances, but there's no doubt that the armor of the tank is much worse than the T-30s. But my question to you is that if you want to have this armor in some kind of a functional turret, why don't you just play a heavy tank such as the M103 or the Conqueror? Which is why I feel like the Conway has a sweet spot unlike the T-30. And that makes it a very interesting hybrid. It's not close enough to a heavy tank to make it feel redundant, like a T-30 for me at least, which makes it more fun over many games than the Tortoise. You never feel like you are truly in an annoying matchup. But then again, you don't have those extreme moments like you do in the Tortoise when there's a whole host of tanks that don't know about the weak point on top of your tank, and you get to use the highest DPM in the game on them. And so I guess it comes down to you whether you want to focus on the Conway. For me, it's a novel tank, and it certainly has its own niche in World of Tanks. But one recommendation: don't sell the Charioteer because it is godlike at tier 8. And also watch out when you get the next tank, the FV4005, because you might be brutally disappointed with it. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this tank review, or maybe it was just useful to you. If it was, please consider giving it a like down below. It really helps the channel out. And let me know in the comments down below what you think about the FV4004 Conway. Is it one of your favorites? Do you rarely see them in the game? And how do you feel it stacks up compared to some of its rivals? Maybe such as the Tortoise, the T-30, or the Conqueror. And as always, thank you so much for watching. You've been epic, and hopefully I'll see you soon.